Okay, everybody, welcome to another edition of the Big Questions with Big John. This is your host, Big John. And as always, another interesting guest for conversation in this episode. Let me introduce to you to Professor Fred T. Golder. Fred is a professor of law, an adjunct professor of law at Massachusetts School of Law, and he teaches courses in labor and employment law and also for alternative dispute resolution, which is what we'll be talking about today. He has a book out called Reaching Common Ground, a comprehensive guide to conflict resolution, which you could see on his bookshelf behind him. But if you want to do more than just see it on his bookshelf, go to Amazon.com. You could order it there. So welcome everyone to Professor Golder, or Fred Golder. How you doing today, Professor?
I'm fine, John. I tell you that I've been teaching and practicing conflict resolution now for over 25 years. And about 2015, 2016, I started to wonder, and I started to say, what is going on with all the polarization that's going on around?
Right.
And so I started to do some very extensive research into the scientific basis of the why of conflict. And I was fortunate to have some of the most brilliant people assist me, suggest books to read. So for about 5.5, 6 years, I've been doing research, looking into genetics, looking into evolution, looking into psychology, personality, motivation, and to really understand it so that by understanding the reasons for the polarization, I could at least start to work toward finding some good solutions.
Wow. All right. So you've got me hooked in a lot of different ways already. First of all, I love that you mentioned genetics and research and all that. My educational background is in biology, educational and evolutionary biology and human genetics. So you've got me hooked right there. And also obviously very much involved in what's happening in the country, both politically and philosophically, in terms of, I'd love to, I don't even know where to begin with you, Professor, because you've set my mind off already in so many different directions. So let's start off with the basic one. The country the US does seem to be highly polarized. I would say I won't say today, but it's been highly polarized, I would say, for at least, to my sort of recollection, maybe the past 20 years. And it only seems to be getting worse. It seems to be intensifying more and more. Now, my particular take on it, it's due to our more and more desiring to be part of identity politics, that we belong to groups rather than see ourselves as individuals. But that's just my sort of theory. Like, please tell me, according to your research, what is the cause of our polarization, of the what seems to be almost irreconcilable differences in our country these days?
Well, first of all, we talked a little bit about genetics, and I will tell you, and this is very, very strange. One of my colleagues was very helpful in giving me information, teaches at New York University. And there's actually a genetic difference between people who lean left and right. I know it sounds strange, but if you think about it, if you understand psychology, we have the big five major traits, and some of those traits correspond to how people think politically. So there is an important genetic difference. And my theory is the reason we've become more polarized over the last 20 years is because we now have an internet. And the internet gives us the opportunity to basically collaborate with people who already think like we do. So, for example, if you happen to be very conservative, there are internet groups that you can go to, and they confirm what you already believe. So the confirmation bias has an impact on where you search out your information. And I see that as one of the leading reasons for the polarization, that you really have an opportunity to stick to one particular ideology and not accept any ideology. So if it doesn't comport to your opinions that you've developed over your lifetime, you basically don't consider it, and you only accept those things that support your opinions that you already had before you started the process.
Right. And, I've often heard that, for example, people who lean conservative tend to be more rigid. They tend to respect order. They tend to like to categorize things very strictly, whereas those who used to, by the classic definition of a liberal or leftist, would be that those who like to change things up, to create change. They were the more perhaps entrepreneurial sorts. But it's interesting to me because what you just said to me is a little bit foreign. For example, I love to use the internet to seek out people of the opposite opinion, whether it's to just get into discussion or to learn more about it. But that's also interesting to me, for example, because I'm a libertarian. I tend to just be more in terms of individuals as opposed to groups. So I hold the individual in much higher regard than I do the community, the state, the nation, right? And so it's interesting to me, like, how does that play into your research? Or was there a carve out for people who are more, I don't want to say independent minded, but say the libertarians or the I was going to say perhaps the anarchists or people of that sort who kind of reject authority. Like, how do they play? Do they contribute to the polarization? Are they the most affected by it because they see everyone around them being forming tribes against them, so to speak? How do they, if any, how do they fit into this model?
I think the libertarians are really in a different category or class. I think the libertarians tend to be more suspicious about fixed ideas. They're more open to different ideas. And that's one of the big five traits when you're talking about psychology, that people are open to new ideas and not likely to be in, how shall we say, if you have an open mind, you're more likely to be liberal. If you have a closed mind, you're more likely to be in one side or the other in terms of you're either a blue or a red.
Right.
And they've actually done some studies about how blues and reds, their moral foundation. For example, they found in the studies that blues rely primarily on care, fairness, and liberty. That's their moral foundation. So everything that they look at, and they have a lens. We all have a filtering lens that we look at the world. It's not the real world, but it's the way we perceive it. And it doesn't really matter. That's what they see is what they think is real and not necessarily.
So that's an interesting, there's reality, then there's the perception of reality. But it still doesn't sort of address why so you feel, if I got your initial thing, that it's really the internet that's intensified these differences. Because look, there's always been liberals, there's always been conservatives. I remember, look, I grew up in New York City, a very, a bastion of liberal politics. And I remember growing up back then conservative, in that, and wondering why I was different than everybody else, right? At least from that thought perspective, right? I don't mean to make it sound too tragic. But also I've noticed right now that the traditional definitions of what was liberal and what was conservative seem to be all jumbled up now. And I think that has to do more with the blind acceptance of the tribe, of the identity politics. For example, growing up, even as a conservative in a liberal town, the one thing I always respected about the blues, as you put them, was their defense of free speech. I remember them defending the Nazis to march, their right to march in Skokie in the late 70s. And I always found that to be a very, what's the word I'm looking for? Admirable trait, even though I didn't agree with the rest of their philosophy, because I said free speech is the foundation of progress. So but now I look at it and I see that the blues, so to speak, in many ways are not supporters of free speech, because you have the trigger words, you have the hate speech, quote unquote, I've heard a lot of progressives say like they don't believe in the First Amendment anymore in terms of free speech. And on the other hand, conservatives who used to be what I viewed their best quality would be like a free market, and all of a sudden they're for currency manipulation and for tariffs and subsidies and things that were an anathema, say, to the Milton Friedmans of the world 25, 30 years ago. Where did this juxtaposition come from, Professor? Because it seems to me that it's polarization, but it seems to also be in a tempest, right? It's the polarization and the switching. I don't know what the bearings are anymore.
Well, that's the other thing. Okay. We have a tendency to label things. So, for example, if you supported Trump, for example, I might label you as conservative, but there may be only one thing you voted for Trump. Maybe you voted for him because you didn't like the other candidate. So the point is, when someone says I voted for Trump, you automatically have this whole idea. You get the stereotypical notion of what it means to vote for Trump.
Right.
You just think, my God, this person is insane. How can you vote for somebody? He's crazy. And you go on and talk about it. But he might be a dark triad personality. So if you say I supported Trump, it doesn't mean anything except you supported Trump. But we have a tendency to stereotype. So if you say you supported Trump, it must mean that you're really conservative. On the other hand, if you say, I supported Hillary Clinton, it says a whole bunch of it, and it may have nothing to do with anything except I just happen to like him better. And I might not necessarily be in that category of conservative or liberal. And that's what's really happening. You've got some conservative people that, for whatever the reason, are not conservative the way we used to know it 20 years ago.
I agree with you 100% on that. Yeah. It's fascinating to me that you seem to have both, which sounds, what I'm about to say sounds contradictory. It's almost increased rigidity and increased turmoil. It seems to be, I kind of picture it like a steel container that is very rigid in its form, but within the container, you've got craziness going on. Things are bouncing off the walls. And that's sort of the way I view it right now. I don't know if you view it the same way, whereas I've talked to friends of mine, and like I said, as a libertarian, I had no horse in the race in terms of Trump, Clinton, Biden, like none of those. But in talking to people that I've known for a long time, both on the left and the right, for example, in New York, I had traditional Democratic friends who were like the typical, what I would call old school Democrats, like pro-union, but not necessarily what you would consider the radical left, for lack of a better term. But all of a sudden they were supporting it, because you know what, we can't let this guy Trump get in. So I'm supporting the AOCs and the Bernies, even though in my own philosophy, I don't believe in socialism. I don't believe in this. I don't believe in that. And then on the right, people in New York, Republicans, conservatives who grew up hating Trump because he used to walk around proudly saying he was a New York Democrat, right? And he used to hang out with the Clintons and all that famously. Well, why are you supporting him? Oh, well, he's a Republican and, we can't have Clinton come in. And all of a sudden I said to myself, okay, I almost can, in my mind, do the cognitive dissonance to say, this is what you believe and this is what you're voting for, even though I don't abide by that. But I can understand when people do it. But then the second time around, to still stick to it almost seems like self-flagellation at some point, right? I mean, okay, you voted for X because you thought they were better than Y, but the second time around, when X has not proven to align to your personality or your core beliefs, why stick with X? Is it just because he belongs to your tribe?
Yeah, you get put into a bucket, and sometimes it's difficult to break away. We have a psychological thing. If we start down a road and we go down that road, we discard anything and accept. So what happens is it becomes, I supported Trump, so how can I not support Trump? So you rationalize. We have a wonderful way of rationalizing. Well, why are you supporting Trump now? Because, and you go A, B, C, D. Logic and rational has nothing to do with it. You're emotionally tied, and the emotion really controls what your brain does. Have you read, if you haven't read one of my colleagues, Adam Grant, his book?
I have not, no.
Yeah, it's an interesting book. And Kahneman wrote a great book about thinking fast and slow. So we oftentimes make decisions emotionally. That's brain one, or system one, as they call it. And it's because the system one brain has essentially allowed us to evolve from 200,000 years ago to today. It kept us alive because we reacted.
Right.
Because if we had to think rationally and logically about every decision we had to make 200,000 years, we never had people come to the next generation. We were dead. So the brain one, or system one, was our emotion. And system two is something which is developed after system one. So we're really almost controlled by our system one until we sort of be mindful about it and say, hey, wait a second. This doesn't make any sense. I'm emotionally tied to it. But now when I start to think about it rationally, when I take the time to think about it rationally, it doesn't make any sense. But a lot of times, instead of saying, I made a mistake, they just keep going down the road, they keep rationalizing and explaining things that really have no explanation. It's almost like religion, John.
Right.
I believe. Well, why do you believe? And which is fine, but there's no rational basis for having faith. There's no rational basis for supporting the conservative, the liberal, the reds and the blues. And it's, as you said, it's become who knows what. You label and you get yourself into a lot of trouble.
Yeah, it's crazy. I think I was listening to a talk by Dr. Peterson, Jordan Peterson, and he classified it. He gave a good sort of empirical example. He said, listen, if you're in business and you want to shake things up, you want an entrepreneur, man. You want someone who isn't afraid to fail 10 times before they hit the one big idea. And those tend to be, generally speaking, the people who are high in openness, as you mentioned, as part of one of those 5 basic personality traits. They're very, they tend to be very agreeable. But if you have something that works, you don't want a company of Elon Musk's. You want a company of conservatives, because they will keep the ship going. They'll keep it on course. They'll keep making money for you. And that's why typically, growing up, what was the conservative response to a career? Get a job at a bank, get a job at an insurance company, because those things never change, right? And we'll always need them. Whereas if you were an entrepreneur, you were like, oh, I want to make the next great widget. Well, I may have to go through 10 companies, 10 iterations before I hit my one big idea, right? And it's interesting to me, the personalities that become good entrepreneurs and the personalities that become, say, good managers, good shepherds of an existing idea. And without judging which one is better or worse, because I don't think there is a better or worse in that case. It just is,
That's right.
So that's very interesting to me that you would also come back to that. Okay, given now that we have all this conflict in the country, your book is promising me, Professor Golder, that I'll be able to handle these conflicts and these. So give us the premise of how we deal with people that we find unreasonable, that in everyday life we run across people that we just don't agree with or don't like, or we're forced to interact with them without necessarily enjoying the interaction, but we have to do it either for personal reasons or business reasons. What are some techniques that you could share with us that would help us cope in those situations?
Sure. Okay, the first thing, John, once you understand the reasons for the differences, for example, there are no 2 human beings on the planet that are alike. We are all different. We have individual differences. We have gender differences. We have personality differences. We have every single one of us has different life experiences that impact on us, and they form our opinions. And some of these opinions become our core values. And you can't change anybody's opinion easily. They have to change it themselves, and you can't change their core values. So when you realize that, when you accept the fact that you can't change anybody's opinion or core value, I find it liberating, because I don't have to waste my time changing your mind or your opinion, because I'm not going to be able to do it. So instead of doing that, what I like to call traps to avoid when you're
Okay.
having conversations with people. And so I'll give you my 3 traps to avoid,
Sure.
because these are important. The intent impact trap. We do it all the time. I do it. Everybody does it. I try to be mindful about it, but we very oftentimes will confuse intent with impact. So if it has a really negative impact on us, we immediately have this idea, well, he must have intended that. Like you're driving your automobile in a nice way, and all of a sudden someone cuts you off in traffic. And so you immediately get really angry because he must have intended to kill me. And we get into this intent impact trap. And the truth of the matter is, John, you have no idea what's in the person's mind.
Right.
So don't confuse intent with impact. And you won't get mad when someone says something or does something that has a negative impact on you. So that's a good trap to avoid. And which also goes with my second trap to avoid, which is judgment assumption trap.
Okay.
We're always doing it. We're making assumptions and we're forming judgments about what people do or say. Instead, I like to call it a learning opportunity. So instead of judging what you say, I'm going to learn things. And I'll talk about that when I start to tell you about those things you should be using, the tools you should be using. And the third one is what I call the binary trap, either or. People are always thinking, well, it's either you're either a conservative or you're a liberal. You're either red or blue. You're either this or that. We have to stop thinking in those terms because it's multiple. It's not simply black or white, John. There's many different variations in colors, and we have to stop thinking in terms of either or and start thinking of things. So my tools that I use, and this is all part of the book, my 3 tools that I use is open-mindedness. So if you keep an open mind, John, you can learn things. If your mind is closed, you're not going to learn anything. So
that's true.
You want to be open-minded. And the other thing that I find important is I like to have a curious mind, a learning mind. I'm not judging you. Nobody wants to be judged, John. They want to be heard. They want to be understood. They want to be respected and valued. They don't want to be judged. So instead of having a judgmental mind, you have a curious mind to learn what this person is all about. And finally, you want to work together. Whenever you have a difference of opinion, instead of having judgments, really what you're doing is you're trying to work together to find a solution.
You know, all the things you say make sense to me in a lot of different ways. Like I was just thinking, like when you said, it's not a binary choice. As a libertarian, I get that all the time, obviously, because when you don't belong to one of the 2 major tribes, and I'm assuming the green people get this, or people who are outside that, the duopoly, so to speak. Well, if you're not for Trump, you must be for Biden. No, I kind of find both of them for various reasons to be distasteful. See, by voting libertarian, you cost Trump a vote. What? How does that math work? Libertarians are just Republicans who like to smoke weed. Oh, really? Like they're always fascinated when I tell them I'm straight edge. I don't drink or do drugs, never have. That's just my particular choice in life. But as a libertarian, I'm like, hey, you should be able to do whatever you want, So I always run into that. So on a daily basis, so I fully understand that. And then your other point, which I found fascinating, is once you accept and you're not judgmental, it frees you to be able to work with the person. I don't know if this is derivative of Skinner or Lovaas or any of these behavior modification folks, but in working with my son who is autistic, that was one of the things initially. We were lucky enough to meet with Dr. Lovaas, and that was one of the things he explained to us, that it's not what you think makes your child happy. It's not how you think your child should be learning. It's accept how he learns and how he derives joy, and then work with him to be able to facilitate that. And in the process, he's going to make you happy, because now, it's a feedback loop, so to speak, right? So very early on as parents, we learned, like, okay, it makes him happy as long as he's not self-injurious to himself or others, that you just say to yourself, okay, he enjoys sleeping on a sofa, not a bed. At the end of the day, is that really a crime? No, it's not. So why would I force him to be uncomfortable? And small things like that. But where I found it help was in corporate America, that when I was still like running around companies and dealing with other people, to learn what motivates people, what makes them happy, what they are there to work for. 90% of the time I'd say it's they're there to get paid, and you accept that. But there's some people who are there for recognition, or they're there for learning, or they're there for acceptance. And once you understand that, if you're their manager or their colleague, once you understand that, a lot of this conflict goes away. And if you're able to deal with them on that basis, to be able to say, okay, I'm not judging you for the fact that you don't care what you get paid, right? Why would I care? Oh, you want to be recognized for your contributions. Okay, let's work on how you can get that, And then all of a sudden, my team is increasing its productivity, it's increasing its efficiency, right? So from a very practical perspective, if you're a manager, if you're a business owner, if you're anybody who finds himself in a group of disparate individuals, I would think these techniques are very valuable, because not only do they keep the peace, so to speak, but they help everyone produce more efficiently and in greater volume, I would say. I mean, do you find yourself, have you consulted with businesses, for example?
All the time.
All the time. I almost knew what the answer was going to be before you answered. But so do you find that once you explain this to folks, that they're receptive to it, or is there still that resistance where, it sounds good, but I don't know, is it Tony Robbins-ish type of thing? I don't know. Like, what's the reaction you get from folks? Is there resistance?
It varies. It varies, like people vary. Now, it's kind of interesting that you mentioned we're all different, and we all have different needs, and we satisfy those needs in different ways. And when I talked earlier about assumption, that's what we should never do. You'd never know why a person is doing something. And if you make an assumption, you're never going to learn anything about why the person did what he did or what makes him happy. For example, your son. So instead of thinking, well, this wouldn't make me happy, well, it doesn't matter. It's not about you. It's about him. So what you really want to do is you want to listen very carefully. You have a learning conversation. You listen very carefully, and you say, okay, what is it that you need? And then you work to fulfilling the need, and you solve the problem.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. All right.
Listen.
Yeah.
John, thank God we're all different. If we were all the same, this would be a terrible, terrible world.
Oh, it would be horrible. And that's why I think that's one of the main draws to libertarianism, or I'm this far away from calling myself an anarchist, to be honest with you. But I haven't taken that final step. But one of the drawing points of libertarianism is exactly that. We need the Da Vinci's of the world. We need the Archimedes of the world. We need the Elon Musks and the Jeff Bezos, not because I think they're honorable people, but this is how society moves forward. It's how we all, their eccentricity, their genius, their differences are what lift all of us. And I think we all benefit by having a diversity of talents and personalities and people. And of course, that could also be bad in some ways, right? Because there are those who have psychopathy and whatnot that are different. But it doesn't mean, that in and of itself, we all need to be homogeneous. I think that's a horrible proposition for mankind. And unfortunately, though, I don't know, Professor, if you see it or not, I almost have a feeling like our society is so desirous to move in that direction, where we're all the same, we're indistinguishable from one another. Differences are to be eliminated, and I find that saddening, to be honest with you. That A, that it's happening, and B, that it would even be considered, like that this would be a good thing.
It's actually very dangerous. Let's go back to biology. Do you know what saves species?
Oh,
Diversity.
mutations. Yeah,
Diversity.
diversity. Yeah, mutations. Yeah.
I mean, for example, bananas. There's only one variety of banana, and we're in trouble with bananas. The fact of the matter is, the diversity actually is what's essential for the survival. For example, some humans are better in one environment rather than another environment. So the fact that you've got this diversity allows our species, the human species, to go on. When we become the same, we're going to get ourselves into trouble, because it's nature. If you look at nature, diversity is what really drives evolution.
I agree with you. And I think not too many people are willing to accept that. And again, it's to our detriment that people don't accept that. Let me ask you this. Say you find yourself now, you're open to your suggestions. You try to understand the other person. You try not to be judgmental. You have an open mind. You're curious. But the person you find yourself, I don't know, for lack of a better term, forced to interact with, say in an office setting.
Sure.
You've tried listening. You've tried not to be judgmental. But for whatever reason, that person apparently goes out of their way to irk you, regardless of intent. In your mind, is there such a thing as an irredeemable situation where you say, look, these are just two personalities, they're two individuals that are they're oil and water, that's it, they're not going to get together? And at that point, is it part of that recommendation in somewhere in your philosophy to say, it's best that we just kind of decide that one has to go or both have to go? Now, perhaps I'm speaking more from the position of, say, a manager or an office manager or business owner who has two talented employees, but you can't leave them in the same office at the same time. And maybe you can't afford to put them in separate locations or whatever. How do you get to that conclusion or to that sort of decision point? Or in your mind, is it always a salvageable situation?
Well, put it this way, it's always possible, but there are situations where it becomes very, very difficult. And sometimes the better course of action is just simply to separate. Because look at it this way, I can provide knowledge, I can provide information that would really solve your problems. But if you're not willing to absorb them, if you're not willing to accept those ideas, then there's really nothing I can do. It's sort of like you take a horse, you lead the horse to water. You can't make the horse drink the water. You can only give the horse an opportunity to drink water. And there's nothing you can do if someone doesn't want to learn. They have a closed mind and they're not willing to bend. They're not willing to find common ground or reach common ground. Then there are those few times that you just say, we did our best. It's just not going to work because we have oil and water.
Exactly. Now, just out of curiosity, as sort of from your experience, empirically speaking, do you find that what percentage of cases end in that sort of result? That, in your experience, would you say, is it that it's, I don't know, 5%? Is it 50%? Is it a quarter? And I don't mean by precision. I just mean a gut feeling of, once you've shown people these techniques, once you've explained to them, once you've provided them the knowledge, how many of your clients would you think come back and say, we still had to get rid of X because we led them to the water, professor, and they just refused to drink? So what happens in what percentage would you say?
Fortunately, and I say fortunately because never underestimate luck.
Right.
Right. I could have been born anywhere in the world. I could have been born to any parents in the world, but I was born here in the United States to two wonderful parents that gave me love, and I grew and I nurtured. But there are situations where it doesn't work. But most of the time, I would say almost I would say maybe 5% of the time, I can't get parties to a resolution, but most of the time I work with people and solve their problems resolve their conflicts, and improve their relationships. Because that's really what my goal is. I go in, I say, look, I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm there to provide information. And with this information, you may be able to solve the problem, resolve the conflict, and improve the relationship. Because what you really want to do is you want to realize that you're only as good as your team. And the weakest link, sometimes you just have to cut that link out.
Right.
But I work very, very hard to try to salvage all these situations. But there are times when you've got someone that might be very talented and really, really good, but doesn't fit into the culture of that particular company or organization. And the person is better off moving into a different place. It's better for the person and it's better for the organization. What I like to call it's a win-win.
Right.
It's not that the person is a bad person. The culture doesn't fit. Sometimes it just doesn't work out.
Believe me, and I've found myself in those situations where just from my own experience, where I've gone to my management and said, this is the wrong fit. I appreciate the opportunity, but I'm not going to be the person who likes being in an office with pets and like this loose form. You don't know where you're sitting every day. Like I don't mind a little bit of chaos, but this not knowing one thing to the next. And I mentioned earlier that I'm a biologist by training.
Yes.
My second degree is in computer science. So like by my education, you would think I'm a very, very ordered person, whatever the mindset that you described, which is like very conservative, in terms of the way I was trained. So there is a part of my personality that does require some structure to the world around me. And there have been situations where I've been cast in because of my skill set with folks who have the complete opposite view of the world. And while I always try to be respectful, and I certainly never try to change them in any way, because that would limit their productivity, I had to come to the realization on my own that this is just killing me. I can't deal with this. So, I would make a point to have myself removed from that environment. But I always found myself to be, and I don't mean this in a bragging sort of way, I kind of felt that I was in the rare sort of percentage of folks who realize that and say, like, it's me, it's not them, and it's like, I just don't fit here, and it's okay, but we need to just divorce and for the better of all parties. And for,
that's a good observation, John, because the fact that you don't fit into an organization doesn't mean you're not incredibly competent and incredibly skilled. It's just that what you want to do is take that skill set and go to a place where it's a better fit.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. But the idea is always never to demean yourself or say, hey, look, I just can't cut it here. The idea is you're excellent. You just don't fit into this organization. And that's the kind of mindset I like to encourage. I like people to have a positive mindset about who they are, because at the end of the day, when you really think about it, John, we're all unique. We bring special characteristics and qualities to wherever we go. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that environment isn't receptive to that. And that's okay. I just move into a different environment where I work a little bit better, which is actually one of the reasons there is some polarization, because the libertarian mindset, for the most part, and you see, we're all different. So you may be a libertarian that has different ideas about things, and I don't make assumptions about the fact that you may have that point of view. So I have to say, okay, tell me what it is that you think about. Tell me what it is that you're passionate about.
Right.
And then we have a really useful conversation. I have yet to find, if you dig hard enough, you can find something that the people have in common. Mm-hmm. And what I try to do is I try to build on what people have in common. And that's how I get conflicts resolved and problems solved, by working together. I said, look, what do you have in common? And the only thing they may have in common is maybe they're both Boston Red Sox fans or New York Yankees fans. But if I can find one thing in common, I use that to build a better relationship between the two parties. And it's amazing how it works. When you find that common ground, where the parties can say, wow, I didn't know that. I didn't know you were a New York Yankees fan. I've been a fan for 40 years. And then you start to have a conversation and things start to loosen up. We have this tendency, for example, I call it, well, I don't call it, but the halo effect and the demonizing effect. So if you like something about someone, you'll tend to have a better feeling about other aspects. And if you don't like somebody, you tend to dislike everything about them. So try to get away from the halo demonizing effect.
Right. You just triggered a memory for me. I remember I was consulting once. I won't say the company, but it was a huge company. And I was consulting with them, and I was just not getting anywhere with their CMO. I was just sitting there, and the pitch wasn't going well. And it wasn't a sales pitch in the sense that we were already hired. We were already consulting with them. But I guess the pitch for what we were proposing, the course of action we were trying to convince them to take. And, at one point he just said, okay, let's break for lunch because we're not getting anywhere or something. And as he moved away from the conference table, he walked behind me. And as I was shutting down my laptop, he saw my screensaver, which was a Ramones logo, the punk group Ramones. And and he might have caught a glimpse of it for maybe 2 seconds, as we shot. And then as we're walking out of the room, he kind of pulled me aside and says, hey, I saw your screensaver. I said, yeah, I'm sorry. I said, I know it's not professional, but I didn't expect you to walk by at that point or something to that effect. And he said, no, I saw them at CBGB's in 1978. He goes, they're awesome. I've been a fan my whole life. And then we just started talking about, the Ramones and then other groups in the genre, and before you know it, he's like, hey, why don't we go out for a drink after the meeting? You could tell me more about your plan. I know a good punk club. And if I'm not mistaken, it may have been, no, it wasn't in Boston. It was somewhere else. But my point was totally unexpected, common ground to then continue talks, and to continue at least the opportunity to persuade him to my point of view, to the point of view that we felt was what was best for his company. So, I understand exactly what you say. And sometimes, but of course, that demonizing effect can also sort of creep in, right? I could just imagine if he was like a disco fan and he saw a punk thing, right? He would be like, "Oh my God, this guy is, he's too off the wall. I don't want to deal with him at all," right? So I definitely understand, but I guess what you're sort of saying is go through the effort to find that common ground without necessarily prejudging it and saying like, or I have to look for X, right? It's more just, if I understood you correctly, Professor, it's more just being open to what they're saying and being receptive to what they're saying and being able to then extract that commonality, right?
That's right. That's the learning conversation, not the judging conversation,
right?
Not the assumption conversation, but it's the learning conversation. And you'll find that when you start to listen with an open mind and the other person, I've been heard, you're going to get a much more, a fuller conversation. You get a richer conversation when people have been heard. Instead of being judged, I'm being heard, and he understands me. And that social human connection is beautiful. It really is when you think about it.
Yeah.
We're social animals, John. We need each other. We can't function without other people. We need each other. So we just have to find where that common ground is, and that's when we really connect.
Well, like Descartes said, how do we know we exist? Through the existence of others, right? So we do need, if for no other reason, we need to know that we're alive by having others around us to interact with. So that's a very interesting point. Have you hung up your shingle to be a marriage counselor, by the way?
No.
It sounds to me like you should.
Well, let me put it this way. I serve as a mediator, so I have dealt with people seeking divorce and trying to find some common ground. And I've done that, but I haven't been a counselor. I haven't been a marriage counselor. I've been someone when the parties are saying, like, let's see if we can work something out. They'll come to me and I'll try to help them find a solution, whatever their problems are. And it's the reason for most problems is we judge each other. I can't change your opinions, John. You can't change my opinions. And when people try to do that, it gets really, nobody likes to be judged. So when you start to say, gee, the house is dirty, immediately you're judging me as dirty, and it starts to escalate. Judging people causes escalation. Escalation causes anger. Anger causes disruption. And my goal is to try to say, look, nobody's perfect. That's a liberating thing, John. I
agree.
I'm not perfect. If I've offended you, I'm sorry that I've offended you, truly, because that was not my intent.
Right.
I love you. I want to share my life with you. I am sorry if you took it the wrong way. That was not my intention. And
Right.
you have the conversation by not judging, but instead listening.
And that's so great. I really do. I find that very resonating with me. I try to be like that. I'm not perfect either. There are times when obviously I'll fly off the handle. But I'm trying to be aware of them and to understand when I'm getting to that point, to be able to take a step back and to do exactly what you said. I'm sorry if I offended you, and to be able to say that, I think, is very powerful. Like you said, it's liberating, but in a very practical sense, I think it's also very powerful, because at the end, that allows you to work towards your goal, whatever that goal was in your interaction with the other person, whether it's love or business or whatever, right? So absolutely.
But the apology has to be genuine. It has to be from a recognition that, oh my God, did I screw up? And I am so sorry. So when I'm doing my mediations and solving problems and helping people in their organizations, I keep these three things in mind, because this is who we are. We're social animals and we're emotional animals. We need it all. And I recognize, and I'm mindful of it, that we have hidden biases that affect our opinions. Things that we don't even know are affecting our opinions. So I have to be aware of them. What do I think women don't belong in these jobs? I don't consciously think I have biases, but I have no idea. Hidden from me might be biases that may impact my opinion. So I'm trying to be mindful about that. And I also am mindful about emotions impact our decisions. So I want to try to step back a little bit and not simply react, but think. And finally, remember this, John, the future is totally unpredictable. You expect the sun to come up tomorrow. You expect the sun to set in the west, rise in the end. You expect certain things, but so many things about personal relationships, so many things about things that you think about that are going to happen, they don't happen.
Right.
So if you realize that the future is unpredictable, you don't have to get crazy about planning and doing, and because it's unpredictable. So
almost the same thing. I think Joe Strummer once said the future is unwritten, and maybe, I don't know if that's a more palatable sort of thing, but I guess unpredictable means it's out of your hands, whereas unwritten means you could still sort of craft your fate. I don't know which one of the two I might prefer, but the premise is almost exactly the same. That you should be able to break away from your biases and the worry about that and try to be the best you can, right?
Well, I got to tell you a funny story about a great golfer from South Africa. He was a professional golfer, and essentially Gary Player. So Gary Player is out and he's golfing, and he's off the green in a sand trap, and he hits the ball and it goes right into the sand trap. From the sand trap right into the hole. So some guy out in the yelling, "Lucky shot, Gary!" And Gary Player turns around with his South African accent. He says, "It's a funny thing. The more I practice, the luckier I get."
Yes.
So you can, in some respects, make it possible, or at least increase the chances that you're going to have a better future by preparing, by practicing, by doing things that may lead to the possibility of a situation that you want to see happen. Things don't happen by themselves. You've got to sometimes have to make it happen
Right.
by working toward that goal.
That's a great sentiment. I love that, and I also love the fact that you acknowledge that we're all living in a society. We have to interact with other people for the most part. We need to interact with more. So the ability to do so, even if you disagree with them, even if you say, I'm never going to run into this person again, whatever the case may be, to be able to be civil. And I think that is part of the polarization, without a doubt. And the inability to see individuals as opposed to groups. So I do agree with you on that. All right, Doctor, Professor, this was fantastic. I love this conversation. As we're nearing the end of the show, I want to hit you up with what I typically do of my guests, is ask them some silly questions. So feel free to answer as you see fit. First of all, what is your favorite author? Who is your favorite author and or philosopher that you would say you either enjoy or was most impactful in your life or career?
That's a great question. And when I was in the first grade, I got my first library card. And I said, wow, this is amazing. I have a library card and I can get all these books. I was so excited. So when you tell me who my favorite author is, I just enjoy reading. And books that I usually read are nonfiction books, and they're books to make me think, to improve my life, to understand what motivates people, to understand. So when you talk about my favorite authors, I don't know if I can tell you I have a favorite author. I can tell you that I've read a number of books on psychology, a number of books on conflict resolution, mediation. I've read these books to learn, to basically try to improve the quality of my life and to helping other people improve the quality of their lives. So any book that does that, and there's just so many that's hard to say. As far as I do admire Ralph Nader as a consumer advocate. He was someone when I was in law school I would look up to as the kind of lawyer I wanted to be, to basically to do justice.
Right.
And I did that in my early career when I represented workers in individual employment cases and employment discrimination. So I represented workers before I became a person resolving conflict. So I admired Ralph Nader as an advocate, someone who was doing it for the right reasons, practicing law for the right reasons. So, but philosopher, oh my God, there's so many brilliant philosophers out there. Plato, Socrates, start from there.
And work your way down.
No, seriously, there's just so many brilliant psychologists over the years and philosophers over the years that have had an impact. And the thing is, John, you just don't know how much of an impact they have until one day you said, I didn't realize what an impact. I had a great English teacher who was, when I was in high school, that encouraged me to write, encouraged me to develop my brain, to expand my knowledge. I just, but it's a good question. It's a good question.
I like
it for me.
You're right, and I always tell my guests, feel free to narrow it down to 2 or 3 people if you want. But that was a good answer. So you just enjoy reading, and you enjoy learning about how to help others, how you could be of value, how you could be useful to others, and I think that's just a great position to be in.
Have you ever read anything by Thomas Sowell?
Yes.
Sowell.
Yeah.
I think he's a brilliant writer. I enjoy his books immensely.
Yeah, he's brilliant. He is also, I think, he studied under Friedman, and the thing I like about both those guys is they take a professorial approach in the sense that they understand that perhaps their first role is to be a teacher. So when they explain things, I could almost picture myself sitting in their class, being a graduate student of theirs, as opposed to the more fire and brimstone political philosophers or economists like Paul Krugman, for example. I don't, without judging what he has to say, the way he delivers his positions is almost dictatorial, in the way he does it. But when you listen to a Sowell, certainly he's opinionated, and certainly he has a point of view, but it comes across as very professorial to me. Milton Friedman, I remember sitting for hours watching all his YouTube videos and reading his books and just saying, I learned something. I honestly learned something because he took the time to explain it, and he explained it the way he would to his, and of course they were both teachers at Stanford. So, so to me, yes, Sowell, one of my favorites, and also tends, not always, but tends to align with my personal philosophies. So, yeah, definitely. Okay. I'm sorry, go ahead.
We're egocentric. So many people don't like to have someone find out that they're mistaken. But there's two really interesting, Kahneman. He's an amazing, just an amazing guy. And he used to look for things that would find him wrong. He wasn't satisfied. I don't want to be right. I want to find out why I'm wrong. And he'd always be searching how to find out why I'm wrong, which I thought was really brilliant. And John Maynard Keynes had a wonderful saying that really sticks with me. And he said, somebody was asking him how he changed his opinion about economic theory. And he said, well, sir, when the facts change, I change my opinion.
Yes.
And that stuck with me. I like that.
Yeah, that's a great rejoinder, actually. It's interesting to me that when I first started working on Wall Street, the first manager I had was a stereotypical old New York Jewish banker, I love him like no other man other than my father, to be honest with you. And he saw me transitioning from being a scientist to being a Wall Street guy, and he saw that I was struggling. So he always called me professor for some reason. And he had that stereotypical New York accent. He would say, "Professor, let me tell you something. In your career, make sure that you're the dumbest person in the room. Surround yourself with people smarter than you." And I never really took it to heart until I left his employ. And then I realized what he meant. And then I realized the wisdom of what he told me. And ever since then, and that was a good 30, 35 years ago, I've been constantly paying that forward to anybody that I've mentored or that I've had the privilege of being their manager, is to tell them, don't feel like you have to surround yourself with people that you find either intellectually or personality-wise inferior to you. That's not a recipe for success. That's not a recipe for growth. Make sure that you hire people that you're going to learn from as well, because they need your experience, they need your leadership, they need your guidance. You need their energy. You need to your point, prove me wrong about something, and let's then work to make it that we're all right. So, and then poor old Saul, like he went in it to this day, when I tell that story, people start laughing because they laugh at the accent and the gait, right? But I found it.
It's a brilliant story. It's
a
brilliant story.
Yeah. Okay, I'm sorry, speaking of accents, what part of Massachusetts are you from?
Boston now.
Downtown
Boston. I grew up in Chelsea, which was a suburb of Boston, about 2.5 square miles. And I moved to Boston after my kids got out of school and left home. And
okay.
Because I love Boston. But what you said about the gentleman that was a mentor to you, it leads me to just talk very briefly about authoritarianism. And the people who are authoritarian personalities surround themselves with people who are less intelligent, which is really their downfall. It's the people who surround themselves with people who are more intelligent, who are smarter from you can learn. That's the person you want to be your leader, not the one that has, because the authoritarian doesn't want anybody that's smarter than he is, which means he's not going to be getting good information, or she is not going to be getting good information, and it's going to lead us down a very bad path.
I agree with you, and I to this day, when I find resistance to that, if I'm interviewing with a client or something, and I find out that because sometimes you'll get feedback on that process. And one of the process feedback you get sometimes is, well, I don't like it when you say that you want to be the dumbest person in the room. I don't, why would I want my manager to be the dumbest person in the room? And I said, all right, thank you. I don't know if we're a fit culturally, and like you said, there's no point in trying to change somebody's mind to that, and I think that because those people are always going to be self-conscious, and they're always going to be looking over their shoulder, rather than accept that, as you said, this is how we progress, So, final question, Professor, what do you do for recreation?
What do I do for recreation? Well, I play tennis.
Okay.
I golf occasionally. I read books. I have a book that I published with Thompson West, and I have to do the supplement every 6 months. So I spent some time researching cases. And the title of the book is Labor and Employment Law, Compliance and Litigation. It's a 2-volume set. Not that anybody wants to buy it except law professors.
I was going to say, it sounds like a textbook, right?
Absolutely. It's law professors, law firms that buy it. The book is actually designed for lawyers who practice in those areas of law. It's 5 different chapters, and they all cover most of the law that deals with workers and workers' rights. But now I have a new passion, and we all should have a passion, John. My new passion is to spread the word, since this book, of getting people to understand why we're polarized and how we can fix the problems. There's an organization called Braver Angels. I don't know whether or not you've heard about it, but they discovered me, and because my book is reaching common ground, and they are an organization, nonprofit organization, and they're trying to get people on they call them reds and blues, and they're trying to get them to work together to solve problems. And it's a wonderful organization. I've been spending time as one of their ambassadors and going around talking at libraries and other venues to encourage people to understand why the polarization and how to fix the polarization. That's what I've been doing.
That sounds great. And why don't you give them a plug? Do they have a website that the folks can go to? Check them out?
That's a good one, yes. It is called Braver Angels. And if you go to braverangels.org,
okay,
you'll find the organization, and you'll find that they discuss things like gun control, abortion, and they have people from both sides, the reds and the blues, and they have civil conversations about their differences. It's really a very unique organization. And of course, you can buy my book, Reaching Common Ground. You can find it on Amazon, on Barnes & Noble, wherever books are sold, you can find my book. And I will tell you, if you read my book, if you understand what I've written in my book, and use these tools that I talk about in the book, you will improve your relationships. You'll have fewer conflicts, and the conflicts you have, you'll be able to resolve them much more successfully.
That is a wonderful note to end on. Both folks to buy your book so you can resolve conflict in your life and learn to work with each other and to embrace each other's positive natures all the way around. Also, braverangels.org, bringing people together to try to find purple solutions. If we mix blue and red, right? Maybe we get some purple solutions. But anyway, thank you, Professor Fred Golder, for joining us today on the show. Really appreciate your time. Please, I hope you'll consider coming back in the near future. Maybe as situations warrant, we'd love to have you again. You're such a pleasant person to talk to. I really appreciate you coming. And for everyone out there, join us again for the next episode of the Big Questions with John, when we're going to have an equally interesting person to chat with. So until then, peace out.
Take care.